Greetings and welcome to this IIRP Graduate School webinar, The Power of Listening Circles. We are going to get started. If you're just joining, please feel free to use the chat and introduce yourself. Some folks are just chatting to all panelists, but if you want to try to select all panelists and attendees, then everybody will know where you're coming from today. So thanks for joining us. We have three guests panelists today, Beth Smull, Kevin Jones, and Trisha Tinsley. I'll be introducing them shortly. We're going to start with talks by each of the panelists, and then the second half of the webinar will be Q&A. Again, if you're just joining, please let us know, all panelists and attendees, where you're coming from. If you have questions today for the panelists, just for the question and answer in the second half of the webinar, you may use the question and answer tab to ask those questions. We'll be reviewing them. You can upvote them if someone's asked a question that you were going to ask or that you would like to hear answered, and we'll try to get as many of those as we can in the second half of the webinar. So right now we'd like to start with the poll. Can we bring up that poll? And we're curious about where you think you might be interested in applying listening circles. It's a multiple choice. So go ahead and fill that poll out, and we'll find out in a moment what folks are interested in, which is really helpful to us. All right, looks like we have close to 600 participants already. This is really exciting. Thank you again so much for joining us to learn about listening circles today. Can we take a look at those poll results? Great, so it looks like 69%, 347 of the people who answered are interested in applying these in K-12 schools, 14% in higher education, 20% in youth justice, 100, 15% in criminal justice, social work settings, 16%. We have workplaces at 31%, neighborhoods and community, 33%, families. That's great. It looks like a lot of folks are thinking that they might be able to use these in different contexts, which I think is really exciting. For me, thinking about that so many folks joining here are not just using these in their work setting, or not just thinking of themselves as restorative practitioners in their work setting, but across different settings and in their communities and families as well. Great. So the numbers keep rising. If you're just joining, please, in the chat window, and I'm going to say this, select all panelists and attendees. Apparently, I don't know if it's defaulting to just the panelists. We're happy to see where you're from, but if you want to let the attendees as well, click all panelists and attendees and let them know where you're from. Thank you so much. Wow, Richmond, Virginia, Anaheim, California, Bakersfield, UK. They're going so fast I can't read the cities. Boston, Massachusetts, Toronto. All right, welcome everybody, welcome. So at this time, I'd like to kick off the webinar. We're gonna start in the first half with talks by our three panelists to introduce the topic about listening circles, share some of their experience. And then for the second half of the webinar, we'll be reading your questions and answering your questions. So specific questions can go in the Q&A. If you have comments for panelists and so for the general, keep those in the chat. But if you have questions you'd like the panelists to answer later in the program, use the question and answer tab that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And you can also look at the questions and upvote questions that you like, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. All right. So thank you. My name's Josh Wachtel. I'm hosting this webinar. I'm the IIRP communication specialist. And at this time, I would like to introduce you to Elizabeth Smull. Beth Smull is a skilled restorative practitioner who has provided direct services to struggling youth and their families. She provides restorative practices, professional development to a worldwide audience of educators, counselors, and social workers, and has worked with schools across the country to improve school climate. Most recently, she helped develop the IIRP professional development on facilitating listening circles and also motivational interviewing, and supported the implementation of motivational interviewing at the IIRP model programs, Community Service Foundation, and Bucksmont Academy through training, coaching, and observation. Beth co-authored a book on FGDM, Family Power, Engaging and Collaborating with Families. She is a frequent presenter on restorative practices at numerous state, national, and international conferences. Welcome, Beth. So please let everybody know a little bit about listening circles and this new event.
Great, thanks, Josh. And it's great to see so many folks joining and so many familiar faces, including my mom. So hi, Mom. So I'm really excited to talk to all of you about how listening circles came to be at the IIRP. So listening circles are not new. Circle practice is not new. It's been happening for since fire, right? So hundreds of thousands of years. And our entry point into this work started around the abuse in the Catholic Church. So 2 years ago, in the summer of, I believe, 2018, in Pennsylvania, there was a grand jury report released that highlighted the church sex abuse in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania outside of the Philadelphia diocese. And for me, it was the first time that this really hit home. And some of us at IIRP started to talk about this and what could we do? What process could we do? Restorative practices is about bringing people together in the wake of harm and moving through a process. So our president, John Bailey, has some colleagues in Australia, Vic and Liz O'Callaghan, and they'd been dealing with the same issue in Australia. And they adapted the restorative conference model, which has its indigenous roots in New Zealand from the Maori people. And they took pieces of that process and kind of created a structured, formal, scripted process as a way to talk about collected harm, right? Or talk about a series of issues that could impact community. So the focus wasn't necessarily on bringing the folks who were abused together with those who had done the harm, but it was to give folks who were left in the wake of this tragedy some voice. So we were fortunate enough to have a church in Bethlehem be interested in this process and wanted to give it a try. So we trained their parish council and other parishioners that were interested in being facilitators. That's one of the things I love about this process, is that it is about building capacity in your own community. So it wasn't about the IIRP bringing in a team of facilitators. It was about us working with their own community members. And those are the folks who ran the circles. And we did a couple events with the church and started to think, man, this could apply to a lot of different topics, right? It doesn't just have to be this one. So we started to think about what would a professional development event look like? How could we do this? And we started to create one. And we did a few pilots last summer in 2019. One in Detroit, one in New London, Connecticut, just again with community members and working through what were some of the issues that they were facing in their community. And we had plans to be moving forward with an impersonal professional development event, and COVID happened. So here we were in March, ready to go, and we now found ourselves in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, and we all saw that as an opportunity to use this process and to use it online. So in April, we started running listening circles online with our students and our staff and alumni and licensed trainers, just to kind of test it out to see how it would work. And it went really well. In the listening circle, you start as a large group and then you break into smaller groups of anywhere between 4 to 7 people. And someone volunteered to be the facilitator. And then there's, again, a scripted process that we follow with the preamble, very similar to a restorative conference. And then after we ran a series on COVID over the summer, we spent 2 or 3 weeks running a series of listening circles around race in our country and systemic racism. And from there, we launched professional development, which is a two-part session. So the first part, you actually experience the listening circle and kind of build some of those competencies, and then this practice in your own community and come back to talk a little bit more about implementation. So we really think any issue, right, that is happening in a community, it could be a challenge or a harm, any issue that has impacted folks in a significant way is an opportunity for a listening circle.
Thanks so much, Beth. And again, we're gonna, if you're just joining, the first half of this webinar is going to feature each of the panelists for speaking about their work and how they're using this in their settings. And the second half will have question and answers. So if you have questions that you'd like to address to the panelists, please use the question and answer tab for that. You can upvote questions that you would like to hear answered, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. At this time, I'd like to introduce Kevin Jones. Kevin Jones has spent more than 30 years working in the fields of social services, mental health, and education philosophy, with particular emphasis on working with at-risk youth and their families as a practitioner and administrator. He has been professionally trained in a number of behavioral management strategies, including therapeutic crisis intervention, nonviolent crisis intervention, trust-based relational intervention, and restorative practices. He serves on the boards of the United Way Community Engagement, Project Oz, and Illinois Balanced Restorative Justice Project. Kevin also worked for the Baby Fold as a respite camp supervisor, providing services and supports for traumatized children ages 5 to 16. He has provided restorative practices training and support for schools and organizations, primarily through his work for the Regional Office of Education in Central Illinois. On his own initiative, he is working to make his hometown, Bloomington, Illinois, a restorative city. Welcome, Kevin, and I hope you can talk a little bit, especially about how these listening circles are helping with your restorative city project back in your hometown.
Awesome, Josh, and thank you, Beth. And yes, you know, with listening to Beth talk about how the restorative listening circles, you know, kind of came about through IIRP. As a faculty of IIRP and a licensed trainer of IIRP and a graduate of IIRP, I had the privilege to participate in those listening circles. I think back to that time, right around mid-March when everything closed down due to the pandemic. And so I'm traveling home from Flint, Michigan, and kind of at a loss about, wow, what is this gonna look like moving forward? And then found out through Beth and through IIRP's networking that they were gonna offer these listening circles. So I had the opportunity to participate in the listening circles following the pandemic, as well as the multiple listening circles surrounding racial injustice. And so as a participant, I was extremely, extremely impacted. It was nice to be in a process, to go through a process where I just had opportunity to listen to others and to share my story with other people. And so what I've done since I've started working with IIRP as a student and as a faculty is the things that I learned there, I'm so impacted by, I can't wait to share with my community. I am currently a retired administrator, alternative ed administrator with the Regional Office of Education that covers 3 counties in Central Illinois. And so I really start introducing and kind of being intentional about working with my regional superintendent and assistant superintendent, Mark Johntree and Molly Allen, about how can we offer this process to our educators, because everybody was kind of in that space, like, what, you know, how do we plan for the upcoming school year or the end of this school year? And my takeaways from the listening circle gave me an opportunity to reflect. And so it made it easier to engage in conversations about, okay, what do we do next? So I started doing a series of listening circles with the educators in my community, a lot of impact. And then after the George Floyd murder and start really focusing on racial issues, I reached out again to not only my regional office, but several other community organizations that were already kind of doing this work of, how do we respond to this? And so I connected with some faith-based leaders, leaders from Bloomington Normal Welcoming Committees, Not in Our Town, which is an anti-racist group, and several faith-based organizations. And we started holding the entire month of August. We did a weekly listening circle. So with a lot of positive impact. In those listening circle, it consisted of various members of the community that I already mentioned, but it also included law enforcement and people from court services. And so it just has some real powerful, impactful turnarounds. And so following that month of listening circles, then here's election about to come about. And so I work with a team of professionals, community volunteers, and we started meeting. And so we put together some listening circles in preparation for the upcoming election. We did one a couple weeks ago, and then we're gonna do another big one on Monday for the pre-election. And then we're gonna do a following one the next Monday on post-election, just giving people that space to share their stories, to help them reflect it and move forward. So, and then the most interesting thing that came about with some of these organizations, they were working with some youths in their community as well. And so I had about 10, 15 youths reach out to me, and we began meeting. I meet with them every Sunday. Started out with just doing some basic restorative practice training and having conversations around it. And then we moved on to listening circles. I'm gonna meet next week with these youth, and they're gonna actually do some listening circles with my support with some of the students in our community. So I've just seen such great impact personally from my experience in listening circles. And I'm always amazed the takeaways that all these people in our community have from these listening circles. And what I found interesting, because I've joined a couple steering committees. I was at a meeting last night with the steering committee, the Not in Our Town steering committee, and just hearing all these community leaders who are actually engaging in listening circles on their own. So the sustainability, having a process that's so structured that they can duplicate has just been powerful. And so I am very thankful to IIRP and all the organizations in my community that I collaborate with, and the generosity of my regional office 17, because they sponsor a lot of this work for our community. So then hasn't been any cost associated with it to provide those listening circles, just to give people a chance to tell their story and listen to others. So.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to be having a Q&A with all the panelists in the second half of the program. But we have one more panelist to present right now, and I'd like to welcome Trisha Tinsley. Trisha has 20 years of experience in social services and community organizing. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Seattle University and has been trained and certified as a business and life coach. Having spent 10 years as a coach and a corporate trainer, she is the owner of Citizen Coach, and she is also an IIRP instructor with a focus on using restorative practices in whole community systems to empower families. Trisha, welcome, and would love to hear from you about how you've been using listening circles and the impact you've been seeing that on the folks that you've been working with.
Thank you, Josh. And apparently when I turn on my video, it's telling me that you have to turn it on.
Okay.
So
All right, well, we can deal with these
I
network
know,
technology
right?
issues. I hope, or not. Why don't you get started and I will, oh, there you go. All
Yeah,
right.
we're good to go. Hello, everybody. I know there's a lot of people out there. I did catch a few places where you're joining us from. I caught Holly, Michigan, and Puyallup, Washington. So I just want to say hello because I live in Seattle, Washington, and I am from the Flint area and have family in Holly. So I noticed those, and Ontario, Canada. So I really appreciate Beth Share and Kevin. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the power of listening and just some of the insights I've had with just not only just the process, but my experience, what I've seen other people experience. So just a little bit about my particular background. I came from, or rather two things that led me to really invest time in not only helping develop, but help train listening circles. One is that I came from some of the best storytellers that America has to offer. I was raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, and had a really good relationship with the Athabascan indigenous folks up there. And they have a long history of oral tradition. And then secondly, I spent a lot of time in Flint, Michigan, which there's a lot of storytelling that came up from the South. And so, and some of the traditions that were left from African descent followed people up from the South and were passed down to me. In addition, there's nothing more than my family culture to sit around and tell stories all day and sometimes just listen. So I'm invested in the narrative, and I'm invested in always spending time to just listen to what people are up to, their background. So that is really important to me. In addition, Beth had mentioned that when this first started with Vic and Liz O'Callahan, and her and John Bailey had kind of made this listening circle to respond to sexual abuse scandals. That same experience happened to me in Seattle, Washington, where our church, at being Catholic, our church wanted to actually set up listening circles. Now, it was a different process, but at that point, I was talking very deeply with Beth about how to actually make a community process that speaks to being heard, right? Having our narrative be told, controlling our narrative, and finding our voice. So, and the first time that I actually did a listening circle, Vic and Liz had come over to America, and I, in the process, and we'll talk a little bit about process later, but there's kind of a large group and then you break into smaller groups. And I was a small group facilitator for a small group. So I was kind of leading everybody in the questions around sex abuse, the impact of sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. Now, I've been Catholic for a long time. In addition, I've been listening and guiding people in discussions for as long as I can remember. I'm 48, so at least 35 years, okay? So I'm like, I got this handled. But in the experience of this listening circle, which I was just trying to get the process down and run through the script, I had really discovered something very powerful about my experience in the church. Now, I had not necessarily been at the hand of any abuse. I had known people, but in the Catholic Church, the process of confession is really important, right? So you're supposed to confess your sins, they're absolved, and everybody lives happily ever after. Now, I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but that's kind of the gist of it. But I had realized in the process of listening to myself answer the question about what is the hardest thing for you, is that I actually learned that I had stopped doing confession because it was such an intimate experience to kind of confess some of the things that are kind of the darkest, or at least what feels sinful, so to speak, to somebody, an individual. And the leadership had kind of abused that trust. And I had never thought of that before. To have this kind of insight and this space to have to kind of have that insight was extremely powerful for me. So in the end, you know, listening really is about developing that clear voice. And that is an important thing that I always try to impart about this process. Now, a lot of people worry about when they're in listening circles, and this has been coming up because I've trained quite a few at this point. I've helped run a few. That people are worried that maybe people are coming and they're not really saying what's on their heart and mind, that it's kind of surface level shares. There's also a lot of worry that people will kind of share things that trigger the whole group. But the important thing here that I noticed is that we need a process and just a tradition, I suppose, set so people can actually start developing their voice. It takes a while, and it takes a while to be as authentic as you can with your shares. So the thing about listening circles is that if it's a process that you can implement and have there in times when there are challenges, when there's repair work that has to be done, people start to develop that practice of saying what's so for them. And what I realized about voice is that, and when I work with people, especially when I'm coaching, I always tell people, no one actually can tell you what it is to be like in your body. So you are the expert on your body and your voice. And this is the very exciting and powerful thing about it. The other thing too is that we're in a culture where listening is really has an agenda. So you listen with an agenda. You listen for red flags, or you listen for this. And a lot of us on this webinar are in the helping field or change agents, what have you. But here's the thing, is that I've noticed throughout the process that it can be really, really powerful to listen just for the sake of listening, to kind of really relax into the process of just hearing people's experience. Now, it is normal to react to people's shares and to judge and to get triggered. But imagine if we only had listening for the sake of listening, and how liberating that could be for people. It allows us to flex a muscle that maybe hasn't been there before, not only personally, but culturally. So as we actually move into more restorative work for those wherever you are in the restorative practice, my invitation though is to be 100% aware of what culture exists around listening, and that we are not necessarily in that space where it's just, you know, okay to just say what's on your heart and mind, and nobody has to have a dialogue about it or fix it. And that in order for it to be us to be restorative, it's really important to actually push the culture of how we connect with each other, because some problems won't be solved unless we listen. And I tell this to my clients all the time. The first step is to listen. And sometimes when just in the point of listening to each other, not only does the problem or the issue or the harm become more clearer, but what we need to do to resolve it or to address it becomes clearer as a community. And this is where it can shift, right? This is the big deal. And this is what I've seen happen with communities. So I'm just happy to share just a couple of my experiences. By the way, if you gave me 2 hours, I could spend all that time telling stories and talking about listening. But I'm going to stop and pass it back to you, Josh. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Trish. And I'm going to invite Beth and Kevin to turn your video screens on. So we're going to break into question and answer, but I want to start right off because we've had a lot of questions about the process itself. So Beth, would you like to just talk through a little bit about what that looks like?
Yes, thanks, Josh. So the process, whether it's done in person or online, is the same. So the beginning portion is everyone comes together in a large group. And that's the opportunity for people to just get connected. So for example, when we did these live at the church, we had, maybe about 30 people came together. So in that beginning portion, there was a welcome. We let people know what to expect from the listening circles. We reviewed the questions that were going to be asked in the small group in each of the small groups by the facilitator. And then we did some share out. So each listening circle starts with 2 lead facilitators who are representative of the community. They start the process. We do an Indigenous acknowledgement. We do some type of welcome at the church. We did prayer. When we're doing these online, we do a mindful moment just to get everyone kind of grounded in their own space. We model the answering of the questions, and then we break out into smaller groups. So the most people we would have in those small groups is 7. And the reason that we keep them to 7 and under is for time and to have a little bit more of an intimate space. So in those small groups, you have about an hour to go through a series of questions. And I'll share with you some of the questions that we've used. And so in your small groups, there's a facilitator, there's a preamble that's read, which is very similar to what you would read in a restorative conference. There's agreements that are standard, and then the group, the small circle has an opportunity to add to those agreements. And then we ask a series of 4 questions. And these are based on the restorative questions. So you could, look at those question cards if you have them, or, just those questions in general. So for COVID, when we did these circles back in April and May, and we're still doing them, Trisha and I did one last month, still talking about the same topic. But the first question is just, what's your name? Where are you from? And what brought you to this space? The second question, what have you been thinking or feeling as the COVID-19 crisis continues to unfold? The third question, what's the hardest thing for you? And the fourth question, what is something in your control you can do in the coming days and weeks? So again, very similar to those restorative questions. We keep it to that past, present, and future. So we always want that last question to be future forward. The facilitator in these small groups take some notes throughout, and they gather the themes that they heard in each circle, so that after the hour is up, you come back to this large group again. And again, online, we've had up to 75 people potentially coming back into the large Zoom room. And then the facilitators use the chat function to type in the themes. When we were in person, we would have it written up on poster boards around the room. And in the final portion, it's just an opportunity for people to share about what struck them, what resonated with them, and even what they want to do next. One of the questions we get all the time is, so then what? What happens next? When do we fix the problems? When do we solve everything? And not yet. This isn't necessarily the space for that. It doesn't mean that can't happen or that can't come next, especially if you're an intact group who's running these. But we've typically brought together people in a listening circle that may never meet again together in the same way. So the what's next is very much more of an individual decision of what's next. And for some people, what's next is, I'm going to run listening circles in my setting. And I've seen that happen, whether they've attended one with the IIRP or one I've run with students, but then folks have just kind of taken it and run with it. So that final piece, when we're all back together again, really just gives an opportunity for people to, if we were in person, we'd have some snacks, like in a conference, it's that metaphorical breaking of the bread, and just to spend some time together and have fellowship. So again, the structure is what provides the safety for the process. That's why it's scripted. And it's not a debate or a dialogue. It merely is an opportunity to listen.
Thank you, Beth. If you're just joining, or if you're joining late, we're in the question and answer period. If you have questions for the panelists, please go to the question and answer panel, and you can type your questions, or if you see questions that you want us to try to get to, please upvote them. We are talking about the power of listening circles. The IIRP has recently launched a professional development event that's just online right now during COVID. And you can find those facilitating listening circles on our webpage. Right now, I've got a question about, are you using listening circles in communities that are experiencing protests, circles with police and community members? Would someone like to take that question? Maybe Kevin, would you start?
Yes, for sure. I think when you watch what's going on, there's been protests in just about every community, as well as mine. My community, Bloomington Normal, together has about, say, 300,000 people, but there's also a lot of rural communities around. And so, so yes, we have done listening circles, well, actually during the protests. And what was awesome, one of the awesome experience or the stories I would like to share, when we first kind of posted online that we were doing a listening circle in regards to racial bias and things like that, we got a lot of pushback from law enforcement, and like, because we invited them. And so there was a lot of questions like, what are we doing? We're going to get together and kind of go at each other. And so I actually went over to the Bloomington Police Department, met with the chief of police, had a relationship with him because I've done some training, restorative practice training for our law enforcement. And I explained to him and a couple of his people what it looked like. And so after the conversation, I made it clear that with this structure, like Beth mentioned, it doesn't, it doesn't lead to back and forth. I mean, that's where the structure comes in, and explain to him about having that platform for everybody to share their story, answering those questions, as well as listen to each other. And so the police chief came, he offered to come.
Is Kevin breaking up for you guys? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So Trish, I don't know if did you have any thoughts on this question?
I have not run, there's a lot of protests in Seattle, and I have not run any listening circles, but I definitely see the opportunity to, and have talked about with people. What I notice is that there's a kind of ideas that maybe listening circles, like, people should attend, and or how do we get this out to the community? So working through some of those issues can be challenging, but I definitely think that if there's a challenging event happening in your community, then it's a time for a listening circle. And also we try to really frame it as a voluntary process, because as Kevin stated, he got a lot of resistance from law enforcement in his area. Well, that's normal from all people who want to come into a community and talk about their experience, even if there's not dialogue. So you should really put it in a frame that you're welcome to come if you feel like you're able to share and hear other people's experiences as well.
Thanks, Trish. Beth, a lot of people are asking about online and what it's like now running these online. And I know you have a lot of experience already. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I have more experience running them online now than I do in person. And it's really one of those things that I'm really grateful that we had spent the year and a half moving into COVID doing this work, because it matched what we needed at the time, whether it was to hear each other around COVID or around race, or now the election, or whatever. We had a conversation not that long ago about what topics should we have. And one of our colleagues said, well, the world will tell us what the next topics will be for this. So I found in online, the community still feels very connected. I did see a couple of questions, I think, coming through about cameras on versus cameras off. And folks have been great about keeping their cameras on, especially when they're talking. Of course, we have some bandwidth issues that folks need to turn off. And, the large share out because of the chat function, like we're doing right now. I can't keep up with all of them, but I'm seeing some run through. There's a lot of connection happening, in that part as well. So yeah, I mean, in person, of course, it's great because you can have that nice camaraderie at the end where, you just kind of wait until they're cleaning up the room to ask you to leave. So you lose a little bit of that, of course, online. But I found it to be really successful. Again, whether it's just been a very small group with IIRP, I worked with Community Service Foundation and Bucksmont Academy to prepare and run listening circles for the families and the youth that they serve, whether we're doing them on a large scale in a public event. So I found it to be really helpful.
Thanks. Trish, someone's asking, if the circle's about listening, what about feedback? Do you encourage feedback or do you leave it up to the speaker? How are you handling that?
Yeah, so it's good to get feedback. We're talking in our last training Beth and I did, people brought up actually trying to capture whether people felt heard, how to capture some of the ideas that came up or the needs, and/or the process. So I think when you do decide to run your listening circle, it is important to not necessarily encourage people to feel like they have to fix or dialogue, but that you take the opportunity to think about how you're going to close your circle and what opportunities can be there to get either a survey, feedback, capture ideas, and check in with people to see how this was for them. I'm a huge advocate for getting feedback in the moment. So I do encourage people to find some kind of way to get feedback, to ask people how it was, or to kind of capture those things while not interrupting that kind of in the moment feel that listening circles provide, right? So you don't want to shove people into problem solving because it's very tempting, right? But you still want to take that opportunity to see how it went and or get information.
Beth, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, in training specifically, I ask the folks who are with us, who are training to be facilitators, to resist the writing reflex. Now that's a motivational interviewing term, but the writing reflex is our reflex to make everything better, to make it all okay for everyone. And it's a reflex you have to fight hard against. So especially in this topic or in this process. Hey, listen, there's other circles we can use for feedback. There's other circles we can use for problem solving. We have all of these great restorative processes at our fingertips. This one is just for listening.
All right, Kevin, you're back. Good to see you back. And I think I want to direct this next question to you since we've been missing you. A lot of folks are asking about schools. A lot of people are asking different questions. How can you prepare students or staff to be involved in this kind of circle? What can you do about passive participants who just may not be engaged? What thoughts do you have for folks about this whole issue of using this?
Okay, can you all hear me? I can't turn my video on, but can you hear me okay? Yeah, so some of my experiences in schools, to be honest with you, most of it has been with adults. You know, there was a school district reached out to me after the killing of, after the racial issues really came to be in the forefront. And I had done some work with them. And so they reached out. It's like, wow, what can we do? And so I suggested doing listening circles at the administrative level first, just so they can have this structured opportunity to respond, you know, to answer these questions for themselves and to reflect what was happening, how it was impacting them. And then what started to happen, this actually took place over probably about a 6-week period. And it started out with administrations, and then they start inviting support staff. And by the end of the 6 weeks, they start inviting some of their students. And that's when I really saw the power of this work. So as far as targeting for a classroom, I spent more time preparing adults to facilitate this process with students as opposed to me facilitating this process with students. The students that I'm currently working with now, these students are all involved in leadership activities throughout their schools. And some of their adult leaders suggested that I start connecting with them, and that's how the relationship started. So I don't want to just give a blanket and say, wow, I do this with students all the time and it grows great. But the experiences I've had with this group of been extremely powerful, and the impact has been amazing, not just on the listening circle itself, just by the understanding and being able to utilize the explicit restorative practices. you know, from the leadership perspective and everything. And so that's where the power has been. The goal is now that I will be working with those students moving forward to help them facilitate their first round with other students. And I don't see this process going away, whether with the students or the communities. But in schools, a lot of work with teachers and social workers and administration. First, doing the listening circles, training them in listening circles, and then just supporting them in listening circle. I can think of one incident that took place after the George Floyd murder, and it had to do with some media, racial issues on media. And so the first approach was to try to get all parties together and do a conference. Well, we worked on this process for about 4 weeks, and we were not able to get all parties together to resolve it. So what I suggested is, why don't we try our listening circles just to create a voice for the people that were harmed, and then including the students and adults. And what happened was, during the listening circles, they were able to tell their story and the impact of this TikTok, racial TikTok incident that it had on them in their schools. And we were able to offer that to them. So as far as specific work with students, it's at the beginning stage, but it's definitely something that I'm looking forward to not only participating in, but more importantly, preparing these students and these other adults to continue this work so it can go bigger than a person and be more about our community.
Beth or Trish, do you have anything to add on that? All right. I have a question here about running listening circles at the University of Buffalo. They're planning to hear what the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color, faculty, staff, and students have been like with the campus police. They're thinking of doing small groups and having a brief set of structured questions. Should they be thinking about doing anything in addition to gathering stories and witnessing?
I can start.
Sure.
Oh, that's a great question. I think I'd like to look at it and digest it a little bit more. But yeah, I think that it would be a great opportunity for storytelling and capturing some of that. Because I'm just wondering what would come out of that folks who were not there to witness it firsthand, how they could experience some of that.
I think that it's an interesting question, and it's this particular question. I mean, oftentimes we get specific situations that are kind of, how do you workshop it, or how do you get it to how to use the best processes to address it. And I think listening circles would be a good idea here. And for the consideration, you know, do what feels is going to support the community. And here I'm noticing that there was a mention of Indigenous cultures, African American or Black cultures. You may also want to consider, ask them what their needs are to go into a space where they're sharing with everybody, right? So maybe with their white colleagues and what have you, and then work in conjunction. If you're someone who's doing this listening circle, and these are just places to look, right? This is not necessarily advice. Really get the input of your community. It's very important before you even start listening circles to kind of get what feels right and accurate for the event that you're talking about, right? You got to name the thing. In addition, it's important to empower your community, because this training, listening circles, when we came through this, when we came to kind of produce this, we wanted it to be something for everybody. So you don't necessarily have to have any particular training or skills, except for learning how to do a listening circle and wanting to be there. So make sure that you get your student body involved, and any kind of faculty that seems like they might represent be a good representative as lead facilitators, small group facilitators. So those are my 2 cents.
And the only thing I want to add is just, again, sharing another organization that I work with. on listening circles. And I think it aligns with this question some. I had a faith-based group. It was a church trying to decide what their stance was going to be on Black Lives Matter and whether they were going to actually recognize that visibly on their church. And so I met with them, I met with their leaders. You know, we talked about what they wanted to accomplish. And what they were trying to do is they had a 30 person board trying to make a decision, yay or nay, if they were going to step out and take that plunge. And what I suggested is that we start with listening circles first, so they can really reflect and respond to these questions, you know, about what they were truly thinking and feeling before they got together to start problem solving. And so what we did was we did a listening circle first, and we followed that up with a topic circle, problem solving circle around that decision. And they were able to come away with making that decision as a church. And so I think of the listening circle as part of the restorative practice continuum. Yeah, I mean, because it kind of fits. I mean, it's close to conferencing, but you're not really talking to a direct person that harmed you, but you're talking about that harm. And so what I did in that process, I just reflected on that continuum. Well, we gotta be able to listen and tell our truth and tell our stories first, and then we can move to talking about problem solving. And that is a lot based on my experiences too. Again, just going through the listening circle process, I had a chance to reflect on how I was being impacted as a human, not a professional, not a restorative practitioner, but how this was impacting me. And that was my takeaway. And that's what I was so excited to share with other people in my community. And so I just became a champion of sharing that information out and really trying to plant seeds around my community about the power of it. And again, just really happy to hear so many people in my community talking about, well, we did a listening circle, we're going to do a listening circle, and things like that. So
I see some questions about online again, and somebody answered in the question, you know, a practice that I know we use at the IIRP is before you speak, you call on the next person who's going to speak. So everybody kind of knows they're coming up. That's a great way to use Zoom and online platforms. Well, we have a lot of questions about the election, less than a week away. A few thoughts from panelists. Yes, Beth.
I'll jump in, and then I know Trisha and Kevin are having a listening circle training, I think tomorrow, on the topic. So I'll start and then pass to the two of them. Yeah, so we are running a training around the topic of the election, I think second week in November, and we're still kind of working out those questions, right? But what is coming out today, an IIRP blog post of just how we at the IIRP have started to tackle this issue in our own workplace. So it's a little different than a listening circle, but Henry McClendon, who works at the IIRP, is a former board member, and I ran a circle last week that focused on worldviews and how do we have difficult conversations with folks who have different worldviews, and then how do we use at IIRP our basic concepts to kind of anchor us in this work. And we're planning a post-election circle just for our organization, and the questions that we're asking there are what are you thinking and feeling today, and what do you need to get through your day? So in a workplace, we're looking at it a little bit differently, right? It's not, in a workplace, you're not necessarily sharing who you vote for, and we're not trying to have a lot of political conversations, but we want people to be able to have some space to share about that. So look for that blog post. It'll be coming out later today. And then the questions for the actual listening circle, I've posted a couple in the chat. It really is an adaptation of that, but Trisha and Kevin, I'm sure will have something to add.
Kevin, do you mind if I go first?
yeah, go for it.
I have so much to say on this, but first of all, thank you for bringing this up, because one of the things that I have honestly, and I'm just going to be vulnerable here, been struggling with is what is the thing that we need to name that is the challenging event that we want to talk about, right? So And I am someone who really is going to be on the kind of further end of progressive, right? So even for me, my interpretation of what's going on is from a Black female liberal kind of perspective, right? And so in that perspective, I've also been kind of saying, well, what do we want to ask about? And it could be anyone's interpretation about the best thing to say. But here's what I want to point out is that the important part of this listening circle is really coming up with a question that gets at the thing, the event, right? We don't want to have it just be US elections or racism, or, you know, you want to like get down to something that the community can actually talk about, so that the exploration is a little bit more focused. And one of the things that came up for me today, just on NPR, I was listening, that they're just on a national level, people are having high anxiety about the elections, just kind of leading up to them. Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, like all over the place, people are having high anxiety. And that's when you kind of start to say, hey, what is this thing that people are experiencing that we need to provide this listening experience for? Kevin.
Awesome. Yeah, and the only thing I want to add with that, because you know, with this group of restorative leaders that we have put together in our community, we did a pre-listening circle on the pre-election a couple of weeks ago, and like I say, very powerful experience. And I can't remember exactly how the question was, the first question, but it was something like, you know, what have you been thinking and feeling as the 2020 election approaches, or something like that. And so it was a phenomenal experience. One of our youth had wrote, she was one of the leaders in the Bloomington Normal Welcoming group, which basically focuses on new immigrants to our community. And there's this organization that really focuses on welcoming to the community. And so she had did this nice write-up, and I used that as the reading for our mindful piece before. But then something that is an African proverb that I came across a few months ago, and it really helped center me during this time when we're having these conversations. And so I always share it out, and it just says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And so it's just that that piece that reminds us, no matter how this comes out, if we are not willing to connect around this issue, what is that going to look like? And so that resonates with me all the time. And I think it resonates with the group, because it's just a reminder that, you know, we don't know how this thing is going to end, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the anxiety is real. But if we're not going to stay connected as a community and not be intentional about connecting as a community, then what's left? And so that's all I would like to add.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to thank everybody. There were such great questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to any more, but thank you to Trish, Tinsley, Beth Smull, Kevin Jones. I want to thank Ben Wachtel, who's been holding down the back end of this webinar for us. And I want to thank all of you for participating. If you have further questions, please go to our Contact Us page, and you can ask your questions there. It'll get directed to the right person. We do have a Facilitating Restorative Conferences event now. If you want to learn more how to do this, you can choose the topic area, which is not universal. For that event, we're going to do a listening circle on that topic, but you're going to learn how to facilitate a listening circle about any topic. We are going to be sending out a recording of this webinar. There'll be a follow-up email, and please, everyone, stay tuned for future webinars. Thank you so much, and have a great day.